A circuit breaker snaps off the instrument panel inside the Eagle lunar module. Buzz Aldrin looks down. The small black toggle is sitting in the dust on the cabin floor. It is the switch that arms the only engine capable of getting them off the moon, and his backpack just broke it. That was the moment Apollo 11 almost became the worst disaster in spaceflight history. But the broken switch was only the beginning of what happened next. To understand how terrifying this was, you need to understand the machine they were sitting in. The lunar module was basically two spacecraft bolted together. The bottom half, the descent stage, had the big engine that lowered them to the surface. The top half, the ascent stage, was their lifeboat. It had its own engine, its own fuel, and one job: get Armstrong and Aldrin off the moon and back into lunar orbit, where Michael Collins was circling overhead in the command module Columbia. The ascent engine was built by Bell Aerosystems, and it was designed to be terrifyingly simple. About 3,500 pounds of thrust from a single combustion chamber and a single nozzle, with zero backup on either part. Every valve and wire around the engine had redundant copies, but the chamber and nozzle themselves, one of each. If either failed, Armstrong and Aldrin were dead on the moon. NASA's engineers had made that choice deliberately. Bell Aerosystems had been developing the engine since spring 1963, and Grumman, the lunar module's builder, gave them one overriding requirement: high reliability through simplicity. They stripped away turbopumps, because turbopumps have spinning parts that can fail. They removed the throttle mechanism because throttle adds complexity. They eliminated the gimbal system so the engine couldn't even swivel to steer. Separate small thrusters handled attitude control instead. The engine fired at full thrust or not at all. And here's the kicker: it had only been qualified for flight a few months before Apollo 11 launched. So when Armstrong and Aldrin were trusting their lives to it, they were trusting hardware that had barely finished its testing program. The one saving grace was the fuel. The engine burned a hypergolic mixture of Aerozine 50 and nitrogen tetroxide, chemicals that ignite the instant they touch each other. You don't need a spark plug, you just open the valves and physics does the rest. But someone still had to arm the engine, and the breaker that did that was now in pieces on the floor. Here's how it happened. After the moonwalk, Aldrin was removing his portable life support system backpack inside Eagle's cabin. The space was tiny, roughly 235 cubic feet. That's about the size of a coat closet for two grown men in spacesuits. As he wrestled the bulky pack off his shoulders, it bumped into the instrument panel. He heard a snap. He looked down and saw the toggle from the breaker labeled engine arm lying in the lunar dust. Without that breaker closed, the engine arming circuit was dead. Aldrin reported it to Houston. Then he and Armstrong tried to sleep. The cabin that night was brutal. Temperature dropped to about 61 degrees Fahrenheit. Armstrong was lying on the ascent engine cover, which is exactly as uncomfortable as it sounds, with a makeshift sling for his legs, while Earthlight streamed through the navigation telescope directly into his eyes. Aldrin was curled up on the floor. The two men who had just walked on the moon were shivering in a metal box, wondering if they'd ever leave it. While they tried to rest, Mission Control spent hours analyzing the circuit, looking for a software bypass or an alternate wiring path. They found a partial workaround through redundant wiring, but nobody was confident it would hold. And while Houston scrambled, a speech was already sitting in a folder at the White House. 2 days before the landing, on July 18th, speechwriter William Safire had sent a memo to Nixon's chief of staff, H.R. Haldeman, titled, "In Event of Moon Disaster." Safire had been inspired by Eisenhower's never-delivered D-Day failure note and the poetry of Rupert Brooke. He applied both to the worst-case Apollo scenario. It was a full presidential address for the moment where Armstrong and Aldrin got stranded on the moon. The instructions were chillingly specific. Before the speech, Nixon would telephone each astronaut's wife. After, a clergyman would commend their souls in a ceremony modeled on burial at sea. Then NASA would cut all communications with the moon. Armstrong and Aldrin would be left to die in silence. Haldeman never showed it to Nixon. After Apollo 11 returned safely, the speech was filed away and forgotten. A journalist named Jim Mann found it in the National Archives 30 years later, in 1999. Some historians call it the greatest speech never given, and Safire wrote it for exactly the scenario NASA feared most. Not a problem during landing, but during liftoff. The planning documents laid out 3 nightmare scenarios. If the engine failed to ignite, Armstrong and Aldrin would slowly run out of oxygen on the surface. If it ignited but shut down early, they'd be stranded in a decaying arc that would crash them back into the moon. And the one engineers lost sleep over, if the attitude control failed during staging, the ascent stage tumbles back into the descent stage below it. The descent stage still had residual hypergolic fuel in its lines. Engineering analysis showed those chemicals mixing from an impact would detonate within 1/10 of a second. There was no rescue ship, no second Saturn V rocket on the launch pad, no backup lunar module anywhere. If the engine didn't work, those men were dead and there was absolutely nothing anyone on Earth could do about it. Aldrin came up with his own solution. He didn't want to use anything metal. A metal object could short out the entire electrical bus, which would create a much bigger problem than a single broken breaker. So Aldrin reached into his shoulder pocket and pulled out a Duro felt tip marker. He pushed the plastic tip into the small slot where the toggle had been. The breaker clicked into place. Quick side note, if you've ever heard the story that a Fisher space pen saved Apollo 11, that's a marketing myth that's been circulating for decades. The Fisher AG-7 was on board, but Aldrin used a regular felt tip marker from Duro. The original broken switch and the pen are now on display at the Museum of Flight in Seattle. And after Apollo 11, NASA installed protective guards over those circuit breakers on every future lunar module. Lesson learned. Now, Armstrong later said in debriefing that he believed the breaker probably would have closed on its own during the engine arm sequence. He called the pen fix just insurance. So did the pen save their lives? Maybe, maybe not. But when you're on the moon with 0 backup options and a broken switch between you and home, you don't gamble. Aldrin made the right call. This is where the story shifts. Because while all of this was happening on the surface, Michael Collins was having his own experience 60 miles above in the command module Columbia. The media loved calling Collins the loneliest man in history. NBC's broadcast during the mission said that not since Adam had any human known such solitude. Collins thought that was ridiculous. In his autobiography, he wrote that he felt very much a part of what was happening on the surface. But that doesn't mean he wasn't scared. Collins carried a notebook around his neck with 18 different rendezvous contingency plans. 18. One for every failure scenario he could imagine. If Eagle launched late, if the engine underperformed, if the guidance drifted, Collins had a procedure. If Eagle couldn't reach a usable orbit, he was prepared to fly Columbia down to a lower altitude and attempt a rescue that had never been tested in actual spaceflight. Every orbit, Collins swung behind the far side of the moon for about 45 minutes, completely cut off from Eagle, Houston, and everyone else alive. During those blackout periods, he photographed lunar landmarks, monitored systems, and ran through his checklists again and again. He was the most isolated human being who had ever existed. The nearest other humans were either on the surface on the other side of the moon or 250,000 miles away on Earth. But Collins was blunt about the worst case. He wrote in his book that if Armstrong and Aldrin couldn't get off the surface, he wasn't going to commit suicide. He was coming home, but he knew he'd be a marked man for life. All right, July 21st, 1969. The pen is in the breaker. The crew has barely slept. Mission Control has run every check they can think of. Time to leave. Capcom Ron Evans radioed down, "Tranquility Base, Houston, you're cleared for takeoff." Aldrin, in maybe the best one-liner of the entire space program, responded, "Roger, understand, we're 1 on the runway." Before the engine could fire, Eagle had to split in half. The ascent stage needed to separate from the descent stage, which would stay behind on the lunar surface and serve as the launch pad. This is one of those engineering details that sounds insane when you actually think about it. They were going to use controlled explosions to cut a spacecraft in half, and then launch the top half into orbit using a rocket engine that had never been fired on the moon before. The separation sequence happened in milliseconds. Pyrotechnic charges sheared 4 bolts at the corners connecting the 2 stages. 2 dead-face connectors blew to cut battery power. And then an explosive guillotine sliced through the entire umbilical bundle and waterline connecting the 2 halves. An explosive guillotine on a spacecraft, on the moon, in 1969. Aldrin counted down. 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, abort stage, engine arm ascent proceed. The bolts sheared, the guillotine cut, and for one horrible fraction of a second, the ascent stage dropped about an inch before the engine caught. Every lunar module pilot described that same sickening drop. Charlie Duke on Apollo 16 said his immediate thought was an expletive. Then the engine lit. Armstrong called out the words that meant they were alive. "The Eagle has wings!" Aldrin reported a smooth, quiet ride. As Eagle climbed, he looked out the window and saw the engine exhaust ripping gold Captain insulation off the descent stage and scattering it across the landing site like metallic tumbleweeds. And then he saw the American flag topple over. They'd planted it only about 25 feet from the lunar module, pushed just 6 to 8 inches into the surprisingly hard soil, and the telescoping crossbar had jammed before fully extending. That's actually why the flag looks like it's waving in all those famous photos. It's not waving, it's wrinkled because the crossbar was stuck. The exhaust knocked it flat. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter later confirmed it's the only Apollo flag no longer standing. Aldrin had set up a 16mm film camera in his window to record the liftoff, but he switched it on 6 seconds late. That's why the famous footage of the lunar surface dropping away starts with Eagle already in motion. The actual moment of liftoff was missed on camera. The ascent engine burned for about 435 seconds, just over 7 minutes. Eagle weighed roughly 10,300 pounds at liftoff, but because the moon's gravity is only 1/6 of Earth's, that 3,500 pounds of thrust sent them climbing fast. As the engine burned fuel, the spacecraft got lighter and lighter. By shutdown, Eagle weighed only about 5,885 pounds and was moving at roughly 5,537 feet per second. Armstrong noticed Eagle was wobbling slightly during the burn, a rolling motion called a Dutch roll. This didn't surprise him. Tom Stafford and Gene Cernan had experienced the same thing during the Apollo 10 dress rehearsal 2 months earlier and warned him about it. Eagle climbed to roughly 60,000 feet and entered an elliptical orbit around the moon. Houston confirmed the burn with triple verification from 3 independent guidance systems. The engine had worked perfectly. Armstrong radioed, "The Eagle is back in orbit, having left Tranquility base." But they weren't home yet. Eagle was in a low egg-shaped orbit, and Columbia was circling about 13 miles above in a higher, more circular path. The 2 spacecraft needed to find each other, match orbits, and dock. This would take 3 hours and 41 minutes of carefully timed thruster burns, and if you think about it, the math is insane. They had to launch from the moon at exactly the right second to end up in roughly the same orbital plane as Columbia, then chase it down across multiple orbits. About 57 minutes after liftoff, Eagle fired its small reaction control thrusters for the first major correction, raising its orbit to become roughly circular at about 45 nautical miles. Then came a smaller adjustment to lock Eagle exactly 17 miles below Columbia's orbit. Then a final burn placed Eagle on an intercept trajectory, climbing toward the command module with Earth rising over the lunar horizon behind it. One of the reasons NASA chose the Tranquility base landing site was its near equatorial latitude, just 0.67 degrees north. That meant Eagle could launch almost directly into Columbia's orbital plane without a complicated sideways correction. Collins tracked Eagle on radar from Columbia, contingency notebook in hand. If Eagle's thrusters failed at any point, Collins was ready to fire the mirror image burn from his end and take over the rendezvous. And here's something wild. While all of this was happening, the Soviet Union's Luna 15 probe, a robotic spacecraft designed to grab lunar soil samples and return them to Earth before Apollo 11 could, attempted its own descent to the surface. It crashed into Mare Crisium at roughly 300 miles per hour, about 500 miles from Tranquility Base. The Soviet attempt to beat the Americans home with moon rocks ended in a crater, making Eagle's ascent the second lunar liftoff attempt that day. As Eagle and Columbia closed in on each other, Collins took a photograph that became one of the most famous images in history. Every human being who has ever lived is in that picture, either on Earth or inside Eagle. Every single one, except Collins behind the camera. At about 40 feet apart, the two spacecraft began station keeping, slowly matching attitudes. Collins had to manually correct a small misalignment before the docking probe engaged. The probe slid in, the capture latches grabbed, and the 12 hard latches on the docking mechanism finally seated. Armstrong cracked a joke about the wobble over the intercom. Hard dock, 3 hours and 41 minutes after leaving the moon. Collins later wrote this was the first moment since launch that he allowed himself to feel relief. The crew spent about 2 hours transferring 47.5 pounds of lunar samples and film through the docking tunnel, then jettisoned Eagle into lunar orbit. Its orbit eventually decayed, and the ascent stage crashed into the moon at an unknown location. If you're enjoying this deep dive, hit subscribe. We cover moments like this every week. So, what's left at Tranquility Base today? The descent stage is still sitting where it landed. NASA's Lunar Reconnaissance Orbiter has photographed it from orbit, and you can clearly see it in the images, along with the tracks Armstrong and Aldrin left in the dust. The laser-ranging retroreflector, a panel of special mirrors that bounces laser beams back to Earth, is still working. Scientists fire lasers at it from observatories to measure the distance to the moon down to the centimeter. It's been operational continuously since 1969. Scattered around the site are the items the crew dumped to save weight for the ascent. Both backpacks from the moonwalk, lunar overshoes, an empty Hasselblad camera body, tools, a small silicon disc the size of a 50-cent piece, engraved with goodwill messages from 73 world leaders. Armstrong nearly forgot to leave it behind. Aldrin had to remind him on the ladder, and Armstrong basically just tossed it onto the ground. There's also a patch from the Apollo 1 mission, left in memory of Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee, who died in the launch pad fire in 1967. And 2 medals honoring Soviet cosmonauts Yuri Gagarin and Vladimir Komarov. Even at the height of the space race, the crew honored their rivals. And then there are the boot prints. Without wind, rain, or any kind of weather, those footprints will remain untouched for tens of millions of years. The ascent engine? It worked perfectly on Apollo 11, and on Apollo 12, 14, 15, 16, and 17, 6 for 6. Build it simple enough and it won't fail. But nobody knew that yet on the night of July 20th, 1969, when Buzz Aldrin was lying on the floor of a freezing spacecraft, staring at a broken switch, holding a felt-tip pen, and wondering if he'd ever see Earth again. Safire's speech was never delivered. The pen held, the engine fired, and 3 men came home. If you enjoyed this and want more fascinating stories like it, hit subscribe and check out the next video on your screen.